Abandoned in the freezing Wyoming mud, a terrified mail-order bride pounded on a locked iron gate. High above, solitary mountain man Silas Norton watched his ruthless neighbor leave her to die. By riding down to save her, Silas unknowingly invited a deadly, billion-dollar secret into his isolated life. The wind, howling through the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, carried the bitter promise of an early blizzard. Silas Norton stood on a limestone ridge, the collar of his thick wolfskin coat turned up against the biting chill. He was a man carved from the very wilderness he inhabited, broad-shouldered, quiet, with hands calloused by years of trapping, logging, and solitude. Down in the valley below, a stark contrast to Silas's solitary timber cabin, sat the sprawling Bar M Ranch. It belonged to Jebediah Miller, a man whose wealth was matched only by his legendary cruelty. Through his brass spyglass, a relic from his cavalry days, Silas watched a plume of dust announce the arrival of the afternoon stagecoach. It was late October of 1883, and the Oak Haven Trail would soon be impassable. The coach rumbled to a halt near the grand wrought iron gates of the Bar M. Silas adjusted the focus. A lone figure stepped down into the dry, swirling dust. Even from this distance, Silas could tell she didn't belong in the untamed Wyoming territory. She wore a tailored charcoal gray traveling dress that was entirely too thin for the altitude, and a small, plumed hat pinned to a mass of dark auburn hair. She stood beside a single, battered leather trunk, clutching a small woven carpet bag to her chest like a shield. Moments later, Jebediah Miller strode out of his imposing ranch house. Jeb was a massive, bull-necked man who treated his livestock better than his ranch hands, and his ranch hands better than his late wives. Silas watched the interaction unfold in pantomime. Jebediah approached the woman. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he grabbed her by the shoulders, turning her roughly as if inspecting a horse at auction. The woman shrank back, her posture rigid with terror. Jeb threw his hands in the air, his face turning a violent shade of red, and began shouting. The stagecoach driver, clearly wanting no part of the rancher's notorious temper, cracked his whip. The horses surged forward, leaving the woman stranded in the settling dust. Jebediah kicked her leather trunk into the ditch. He pointed a thick, accusing finger at the woman, then turned on his heel, walked back through his heavy gates, and slammed them shut. The sharp, metallic clank echoed all the way up the ridge. He threw the heavy iron latch, locking her out. Silas lowered the spyglass, a cold knot forming in his gut that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The woman rushed to the iron bars, gripping them, pleading with the retreating figure. Jebediah never looked back. "Damn fool," Silas muttered, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble, swallowed by the wind. Dark, bruised clouds were already spilling over the mountain peaks, carrying the distinct, metallic scent of snow. In 2 hours, the temperature would plummet below freezing. A woman in a city dress wouldn't survive the night in the open valley, and Oak Haven was a grueling 10-mile walk back down a road heavily populated with mountain lions and desperate drifters. Silas had spent the last 5 years minding his own business, severing ties with a society that had taken his brothers in the war and left him with nothing but ghosts. He didn't like people. He especially didn't like Jebediah Miller. But he wasn't a murderer, and leaving that woman at the gate was a death sentence. He turned and whistled sharply. From the tree line emerged Goliath, a towering dappled gray draft horse crossbreed, as scarred and ill-tempered as his master. Silas swung into the saddle with fluid grace, securing his Winchester rifle in its scabbard. "Come on, boy. Looks like we're dragging a stray out of the snow." The descent was treacherous, the rocky trail slick with freezing rain that had begun to fall. By the time Silas reached the valley floor, the rain had turned to sharp, stinging sleet. He found her huddled against the stone pillar of the locked gate, trying to shelter her face beneath her inadequate woolen shawl. Her trunk lay half submerged in a freezing puddle. As Goliath's heavy hooves crunched on the gravel, she scrambled backward, her eyes wide with fresh panic. Silas reined in the massive horse and looked down at her. Up close, she was strikingly beautiful, but her face was pinched with cold, her lips turning a faint shade of blue. Her eyes, the color of bruised violets, stared up at him with a mixture of defiance and absolute terror. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, her voice trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "No, ma'am," Silas said, keeping his tone low, and even to keep from spooking her further. "The man who locked you out was Miller. I'm Norton. I live up the ridge." She looked at the locked gate, a tear tracking through the dust on her pale cheek. He said, I was a fraud. He said, I lied in my letters. He told me to walk back to Boston. "It's a long walk to Massachusetts, and the snow's going to hit in an hour," Silas said pragmatically. He slid down from the saddle, his boots hitting the mud with a heavy thud. He was an intimidating sight, over 6 feet of muscle and frontier grit, a thick dark beard hiding the lower half of his face, and a nasty scar cutting through his left eyebrow. She took another step back. I can wait for the stage. Stage won't come back this way for a week. Less, if the pass snows in, which it will." Silas stepped forward, unbuttoned his heavy wolfskin coat, and stripped it off. He held it out to her. "Put this on before you freeze to death." She hesitated, pride warring with hypothermia. The cold won. She took the heavy coat, nearly buckling under its weight, and wrapped it around her shivering frame. It smelled of wood smoke, pine needles, and leather. "I am Celeste Whitmore," she said, trying to muster a shred of dignity. "Silas," he replied. He walked over to the ditch, effortlessly hauled her heavy trunk out of the freezing mud with one hand, and strapped it behind Goliath's saddle. "Let's go, Miss Whitmore. You're trespassing on Bar M land, and Jeb Miller is liable to shoot you for sport if he looks out his window." Before she could protest, Silas placed his large hands around her waist and hoisted her up onto the saddle as easily as if she were a child. He took the reins and began leading the horse up the steep, winding mountain trail just as the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall. The storm hit with a vengeance long before they reached the tree line. The world was swallowed in a blinding squall of white. Silas trudged ahead of the horse, his head bowed against the gale, navigating by memory and the subtle dips in the terrain. Celeste clung to the saddle horn, buried inside Silas's massive coat, entirely dependent on a terrifying stranger in a wild, unforgiving land. When the silhouette of Silas's cabin finally emerged from the whiteout, Celeste nearly wept with relief. It was a sturdy, low-slung structure, built of thick, hand-hewn pine logs, chinked with mud, and nestled securely against a sheer rock face that protected it from the worst of the northern winds. Smoke curled invitingly from a stone chimney. Silas led the horse into an attached lean-to barn, sheltered from the wind. He helped Celeste down. Her legs were completely numb. She stumbled. And Silas caught her, his grip firm and steady. Inside, he ordered over the roar of the wind. Celeste pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the one-room cabin. It was a stark contrast to the brutal world outside. A fire was already banked in a large stone hearth, radiating a deep, penetrating heat. The walls were lined with meticulously organized tools, drying herbs, and pelts. A large, handmade quilt covered a modest bed in the corner, and a cast-iron stove sat near a rough-hewn dining table. It was undeniably masculine, smelling of oiled metal and coffee, but it was immaculately clean. Silas entered a moment later, shaking the snow from his broad shoulders. He bolted the door against the storm and threw 3 large logs onto the fire. "Sit by the hearth," he instructed, gesturing to a rocking chair carved from dark walnut. "Take off your boots. You'll lose your toes if they thaw too fast in wet leather." Celeste obeyed, too exhausted to argue. As feeling returned to her extremities, it brought an agonizing, burning sensation. She winced, tears springing to her eyes. Silas walked over, carrying a tin cup steaming with dark liquid. "Drink. It's chicory coffee. Best I can do." Celeste took the tin cup, wrapping her freezing hands around the hot metal. "Thank you, Mr. Norton. I don't know how I will repay you." "You don't have to," Silas said, sitting on a wooden stool across from her. He began wiping down his Winchester with an oiled rag, avoiding her gaze. "When the storm breaks, I'll ride you down to Oakhaven. You can telegraph your people in Boston." Celeste stared into the fire, her grip on the cup tightening until her knuckles turned white. I have no people in Boston. My father passed away 3 months ago. The bank took the house, the business, everything. Silas paused his cleaning, his dark eyes flickering up to study her. So, you answered a matrimonial advertisement. I was desperate, Celeste whispered, the shame coloring her cheeks. Mr. Miller's letters were pragmatic. He said he needed a wife to manage his household, to be a partner. He sent a ticket. I thought, perhaps, I could learn to be what he needed. Miller doesn't want a partner, Silas scoffed, his voice laced with venom. He wants a broodmare who can swing an axe. His first wife died of exhaustion. His second died in childbirth, likely because he refused to pay for a doctor from town. You didn't fit the bill. You look like a stiff breeze would snap you in half. Celeste bristled, some of her Bostonian fire returning. I assure you, Mr. Norton, I am stronger than I look. I may not know how to plow a field, but I am educated and I am a survivor. I merely lacked the physical bulk he apparently desired. He's a fool, Silas said quietly. The words slipped out before he could stop them. He cleared his throat, returning his attention to his rifle. Either way, you're better off up here in a blizzard than down there with him. Later that evening, after Silas had prepared a surprisingly rich venison stew, Celeste opened her trunk to find dry clothing. The trunk was mostly filled with sensible woolens, a few cherished books, and her mother's silver hairbrush. But at the very bottom, wrapped in a velvet cloth, was a heavy, brass-cornered ledger. As she lifted it, a loose piece of parchment slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Silas, who was adding water to the stove, bent down and picked it up. He glanced at the paper, and his rugged features suddenly hardened into a mask of pure stone. "Where did you get this?" Silas demanded, his voice dropping an octave. Celeste stood up, alarmed by his sudden intensity. "That is my father's. He was an attorney. A solicitor. When he died, I brought his private ledger with me. It's all I have left of his life's work." Silas stared at the paper in his hand. It was a land deed, heavily notarized, but it wasn't the legal jargon that caught his attention. It was the name signed at the bottom, Josiah Miller. "Did your father represent a man named Josiah?" Silas asked, taking a step toward her. "Yes," Celeste said, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Josiah was one of his oldest clients. He passed away a few years ago. Why?" Silas looked from the document to Celeste, the pieces of a very dark puzzle snapping into place. Because Josiah Miller was Jebediah's older brother. The brother Jeb hated. The brother who supposedly died penniless back east. Silas tapped the heavy parchment. This deed is for a silver claim, 3,000 acres of prime, unmined land up near the Montana border, and it's deeded to Josiah's sole heir. Celeste's eyes widened. Jebediah didn't want a bride, she realized, the blood draining from her face. He knew my father was Josiah's lawyer. He tracked me down. He didn't pay for your passage because he wanted a wife to manage his house, Silas said grimly, looking toward the barred door as the wind shrieked violently against the cabin walls. He paid for your passage because he knew you had this ledger. He took one look at you today, realized you didn't have the ledger in your hand, and threw you away to freeze. He's probably planning to tear your trunk apart as soon as he thinks you're dead. Silas looked down at the beautiful, terrified woman standing in his cabin. The storm raging outside was nothing compared to the storm Jebediah Miller was going to bring down upon them once he realized the Boston girl and the billion-dollar deed hadn't perished in the snow. For 6 relentless days and nights, the Bighorn Mountains were caught in the suffocating grip of a whiteout blizzard. The wind screamed down the chimney like a tortured spirit, packing snow drifts as high as the cabin's eaves. Inside, however, the heavy pine walls held firm, creating a small, warm universe for 2 people who had expected to face the winter alone. The isolation forced a sudden and profound intimacy between Silas and Celeste. At first, the silence between them was thick with caution. Celeste was acutely aware of her vulnerability, a city woman stranded with a giant of a mountain man who handled axes and rifles with deadly ease. Yet, as the hours bled into days, her fear dissolved, replaced by a quiet awe. Silas was not the brutish hermit the town of Oakhaven whispered about. He possessed a deliberate, gentle competence. When he realized Celeste's hands were badly blistered from her brief exposure to the freezing rain, he didn't mock her fragility. Instead, he brewed a salve of yarrow and bear fat, meticulously applying it to her cracked skin with fingers that were rough but astonishingly careful. "You don't have to wait on me, mister." "Norton," she said on the third evening, sitting by the hearth as he wrapped her hands in clean linen. "Silas," he corrected, his voice a low rumble that competed with the crackling fire. "And out here, we keep each other alive." There's no room for pride when the snow is 10 feet deep. Celeste determined to prove she was more than a burden. As her hands healed, she took over the cooking, transforming Silas's basic provisions into hearty meals. She mended a tear in his heavy wool trousers, her precise stitches a testament to her boarding school education, and she insisted he teach her how to maintain his firearms. One evening, while the wind hammered against the shutters, Silas showed her how to strip and clean a heavy Colt revolver. "My brothers and I carried these at Antietam," Silas murmured, his eyes distant, reflecting the orange glow of the embers. "Thomas and Gideon. They didn't make it back." After the war, the world felt too crowded, too full of men scrambling over each other for a dollar or a patch of dirt. So I came up here, traded the greed of men for the honesty of the mountains. Celeste looked at him, seeing the profound grief etched into the lines around his eyes. She reached out, her small, pale hand resting over his calloused knuckles. It was a bold gesture, but she didn't pull away. "There is honor in the mountains, Silas. But there is loneliness, too." Silas looked down at her hand, then up into her violet eyes. The space between them seemed to shrink. For the first time in a decade, the fortress of ice he had built around his heart began to fracture. "It hasn't felt lonely for the past 5 days, Celeste." The tender moment was broken by the stark reality of their situation. Celeste withdrew her hand, reaching instead for the heavy, brass-cornered ledger sitting on the rough-hewn table. They had spent hours poring over her father's intricate legal shorthand, trying to untangle the web of Josiah and Jebediah Miller. "I translated the final addendum," Celeste said, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. She opened the ledger to a page dated just 3 weeks before her father's fatal heart attack. Josiah didn't leave the silver claim to an unknown heir. He knew Jebediah would kill anyone who stood in his way. Silas leaned closer, catching the scent of lavender soap that still clung to her hair despite the wilderness. "Then who did he deed the 3,000 acres to?" Celeste looked up, her face pale. "My father, in lieu of payment for 30 years of legal counsel. The deed is ironclad. And when my father died, it passed to you," Silas finished, the horrifying brilliance of Jebediah's plan snapping into crystal clarity. "Jeb didn't just want the ledger destroyed. He wanted to marry you." "A husband gains control of his wife's property and assets under the law," Celeste breathed, her hands trembling. "He paid for my ticket. He brought me out here. Once we were married, I would have signed the claim over, without even knowing what it was. And then you would have suffered a tragic accident on the ranch," Silas said, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle ticked beneath his beard. "A fall from a horse. A sudden illness. You'd be buried on the Bar M, and he'd be the richest man in the Wyoming Territory." Celeste stared at the fire, the sheer malice of it leaving her cold, despite the heat of the flames. "When he saw me arrive without the ledger in my hand, he must have assumed I sold it, or gave it to another lawyer. He thought the plan was ruined, so he threw me away. But he'll realize his mistake," Silas warned, standing up and pacing the length of the small cabin. "He'll figure out you packed it in your trunk, and when the snow clears, he'll find the gate empty. He knows my tracks. He knows I took you." The morning of the 7th day broke with blinding brilliance. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world buried in pristine, sparkling white. The sky was an aching, cloudless blue, and the temperature had risen just enough to make the snowpack heavy and wet. Silas stood on his snowshoes at the edge of the ridge, the brass spyglass pressed to his eye. The valley below was still, but a dark line was cutting through the virgin snow on the winding trail leading up the mountain. 4 riders. He collapsed the spyglass and sprinted back to the cabin, his long legs eating up the distance. He burst through the door, his chest heaving. "Celeste! Get away from the windows." She didn't panic. The days of waiting had tempered her fear into a cold, hard resolve. She immediately moved to the center of the room, picking up the Colt revolver she had cleaned the night before. "Is it him?" Jebediah and he brought Harlan Briggs and two of his worst hired guns. Silas said, throwing the heavy iron bolt across the oak door. He moved to the windows, pulling the heavy wooden shutters shut, leaving only narrow slits for his rifle barrel. They're forcing their horses through the drifts. They'll be at the clearing in 10 minutes. Silas, Celeste said, her voice tight but steady, I won't let you die for me, if I surrender the ledger. He can't leave witnesses, Celeste, Silas interrupted, grabbing a box of Winchester shells and dumping them onto the table. He turned to her, his dark eyes fierce and protective. He knows I know. He knows you know. He intends to burn this cabin to the ground with both of us in it. But I promise you, I will send him to hell before I let him touch you. He pressed a quick, desperate kiss to her forehead, a promise sealed in the shadow of violence. Then he took his position at the window. 10 minutes later, the crunch of heavy hooves on snow echoed through the clearing. Jebediah Miller sat atop a massive black stallion, wrapped in a buffalo coat, a smoking cigar clamped between his teeth. Beside him was Harlan Briggs, a wiry, vicious man with a repeating rifle resting across his saddle. The other two men fanned out, their hands hovering over their holsters. "Norton!" Jebediah's booming voice shattered the mountain silence. "I know you're in there! And I know you've got something that belongs to me." Silas slipped the barrel of his Winchester through the shutter slit. "You abandoned a woman to freeze at your gate, Miller. I don't harbor stolen property, but I do harbor survivors." Jebediah spat a dark stream of tobacco into the pristine snow. "Don't play the saint with me, mountain man. That Boston bitch has a book of my family's private business. You send her out here with the trunk, and I'll let you go back to trapping your beavers in peace. The only thing coming out this door is lead if you don't turn those horses around," Silas roared back. Jebediah's face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. "Burn him out, Harlan!" Harlan spurred his horse forward, striking a match against his saddle horn and touching it to a heavy glass bottle filled with kerosene. He reared his arm back to throw. Silas didn't hesitate. He exhaled, his finger squeezing the trigger. The Winchester cracked like a thunderclap. The bullet shattered the kerosene bottle in Harlan's hand. The glass exploded, raining flaming oil over Harlan and his horse. The animal shrieked, bucking violently, sending Harlan crashing into the deep snow. The other two hired guns panicked as their horses danced away from the sudden flames, their hands scrambling for their weapons. Celeste stood beside the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard the deafening roar of Silas's rifle firing again, followed by a curse from outside. "Take cover!" Jebediah bellowed, kicking his horse toward the shelter of the tree line. The hired guns unleashed a volley of blindly fired bullets that thudded heavily into the thick pine logs of the cabin. Silas ducked, wood splinters raining down on his hair. "Load the spare!" he shouted to Celeste. She grabbed the second rifle, her hands remarkably steady as she shoved cartridges into the loading gate. She slid the weapon across the floor to him just as Silas returned fire, clipping one of the hired men in the shoulder and sending him tumbling into a snowdrift. But Jebediah was a seasoned, ruthless fighter. From the cover of the pines, he aimed his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle. The massive caliber bullet punched cleanly through the cabin's wooden shutter, grazing Silas's upper arm. Silas grunted, falling back against the wall, blood instantly blooming down his sleeve. "Silas!" Celeste screamed, dropping to her knees and scrambling to his side. "I'm fine. It's a graze," he hissed through clenched teeth, switching his rifle to his uninjured arm. But the momentary lapse in their defense gave Jebediah the opening he needed. "I'm coming for you, Norton!" Jebediah roared. He had dismounted and was using the sheer volume of the snowdrifts as cover, inching closer to the cabin's blind spot by the stone chimney. He held a bundle of dynamite sticks, the fuses already sputtering and sparking against the white snow. Silas saw the smoke rising from the side window. "He's got powder," Silas realized, his blood running cold. "If he throws that down the chimney, we're dead." Celeste looked at the heavy oak door, then down at the heavy Colt revolver in her hands. The Boston girl who had cowered at the gate was gone, burned away by the harsh reality of the frontier and the fierce, undeniable love she felt for the man bleeding on the floor. Before Silas could stop her, Celeste threw back the iron bolt. She kicked the heavy door open, stepping out into the blinding glare of the snow, raising the heavy revolver with both hands. Jebediah was 10 feet away, his arm pulled back to toss the dynamite onto the roof. He froze, his eyes widening in shock as he looked at the fragile mail-order bride aiming a six-shooter directly at his chest. "Drop it, mister." "Miller," Celeste commanded, her voice ringing out like a bell in the crisp mountain air. "Or I swear on my father's grave I will shoot you where you stand." Jebediah Miller froze, the sputtering fuse of the dynamite hissing a deadly countdown in his massive fist. He stared at the slender woman standing in the doorway, framed by the rough-hewn timber of the cabin. The heavy Colt revolver in her hands didn't waver a fraction of an inch. The wind whipped her auburn hair around her pale face, but her violet eyes were as hard and unforgiving as the Wyoming permafrost. For a split second, Jebediah's sheer arrogance won out. A ugly, barking laugh erupted from his chest, misting in the freezing air. "You ain't got the sand, little girl," he sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to the smoking fuse. "You pull that trigger, and I drop this powder right at my feet. We'll all be blown to kingdom come. You're a city-bred coward. Put the gun down and hand over the ledger." Celeste took a deliberate step out into the knee-deep snow, her boots crunching loudly. She didn't blink. "You severely underestimated my father, Mr. Miller. And you have severely underestimated me. Did you really think an educated woman would travel 2,000 miles into the frontier with the sole copy of $1 billion silver deed without taking precautions?" Jebediah's cruel smile faltered. "What are you babbling about?" "Before I boarded the train in Boston," Celeste said, her voice cutting through the whistling wind like a freshly honed blade, "I paid a visit to the regional office of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. I swore an affidavit and handed certified copies of my father's ledger directly to Operative Charles A. Siringo." The mention of the legendary Pinkerton detective made the two remaining hired guns, who had been sheltering behind the tree line, instantly break cover. They exchanged terrified glances. Siringo was a man who hunted outlaws to the ends of the earth. "You're lying," Jebediah spat, but a sheen of panicked sweat had broken out beneath the brim of his Stetson. The dynamite fuse was now less than 3 inches long. Furthermore, Celeste continued relentlessly, her finger tightening on the trigger. "I sent a writ of probate regarding Josiah's will to Judge William G. Ewing in Chicago. If I disappear, or if I die, the Pinkertons and federal marshals will descend on the Bar M Ranch like locusts. They will tear up your floorboards, seize your assets, and hang you in a federal courtyard." "You have already lost, Jebediah. The only choice you have left is whether you die today or in a courtroom." "She's telling the truth, boss," shouted one of the hired men, spurring his horse backward. "I ain't swinging from a rope for you. Siringo, don't take prisoners!" The two men yanked their horses around and galloped frantically back down the trail, leaving their employer completely abandoned. Even Harlan Briggs, writhing in the snow with severe burns, was desperately trying to crawl away from the impending explosion. Jebediah looked at the sparks biting dangerously close to the paper wrapping of the dynamite. Panic finally eclipsed his greed. With a wordless roar of rage, he reared his arm back, intending to hurl the explosive, not at the cabin, but over the ridge to save himself. "No!" Silas bellowed. Silas had dragged himself to the doorway, his left arm hanging uselessly by his side, blood soaking the sleeve of his shirt. He braced his heavy frame against the door jamb and raised his Winchester with his right hand. He didn't bother aiming. He fired by pure instinct, honed through years of warfare and wilderness survival. The rifle cracked. The bullet took Jebediah perfectly in the right shoulder, shattering the bone. Jebediah screamed, his arm going limp. The bundle of dynamite slipped from his fingers and dropped directly into the massive, 10-foot snowdrift piled heavily against the steep rock face directly behind him. "Celeste, get down!" Silas roared, dropping his rifle and lunging forward. He grabbed her around the waist with his good arm, hauling her backward into the cabin just as he kicked the heavy oak door shut. He threw his large body over hers, pinning her to the floorboards as the world outside erupted. The explosion was a deafening, chest-rattling boom that seemed to tear the very air apart. The cabin shuddered violently, dust and dried, chinking raining down from the ceiling. But the stone wall of the mountain absorbed the brunt of the shockwave. However, the concussive blast did exactly what Silas had feared. It triggered a localized avalanche. A thunderous rumble shook the ground, followed by the terrifying sound of thousands of tons of packed snow and ice giving way, It cascaded down the rock face, roaring like a freight train. The avalanche buried the clearing, bearing the spot where Jebediah Miller had stood under 20 feet of suffocating white ice. Inside the cabin, Silas and Celeste lay in the dark, the windows completely packed with snow from the outside. The sudden, profound silence that followed the roar of the avalanche was almost as deafening. Silas slowly lifted his head, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through his wounded arm. He looked down at Celeste, her face pale and covered in dust, but her eyes were wide open and searching his. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice rough with adrenaline. "No," Celeste breathed, reaching up with trembling hands to touch his bearded cheek, feeling the warm reality of him. "Are you—" Silas slumped slightly, resting his forehead against hers. "I've been better, but I'm alive, and so are you." It took Silas 2 grueling days to dig a tunnel out through the snowpack blocking the cabin door. When he finally broke through into the blinding sunlight, the clearing was unrecognizable. A massive, rolling hill of hard-packed snow had completely swallowed the landscape. There was no trace of Jebediah Miller. The mountain had claimed him, delivering a cold and uncompromising justice that no courtroom could match. The rest of the winter was a period of healing and quiet revelation. Silas's gunshot wound, though messy, was clean. Celeste tended to it with the same meticulous care she gave to everything, boiling bandages and brewing willow bark tea for his fever. As the snows deepened, sealing them away from the rest of the world, the emotional walls between them vanished entirely. They spent the long, dark evenings talking about their pasts. Silas spoke of the horrors of the war and the brothers he had lost, realizing that carrying the weight of his grief in isolation had only made it heavier. Celeste spoke of the bustling streets of Boston, her father's quiet wisdom, and the terrifying realization that she had been entirely alone in the world until she found the locked gate of the Bar M. "You were never a fragile thing, Celeste," Silas told her one evening, watching the firelight dance across her features. "You have iron in your spine. The city just never gave you a reason to use it." Celeste smiled, moving from her rocking chair to sit beside him on the edge of the hearth. She rested her head against his broad shoulder. "And you are not the lone wolf you pretend to be, Silas. You just needed someone worth protecting." By the time the spring thaw finally arrived in late April, melting the snows and turning the mountain trails into rushing streams, their bond was unbreakable. It was a love forged in the crucible of survival, deep and enduring. In early May, the United States Cavalry, accompanied by a sharp-eyed Pinkerton agent sent by Charles Siringo himself, finally rode up the muddy trail to the cabin. Harlan Briggs had survived his burns and had stumbled into Oakhaven in January, babbling about murder, dynamite, and the Boston bride. He had been locked in a cell ever since. The Pinkerton agent corroborated Celeste's story. The men excavated the snowmelt and found Jebediah's remains, effectively closing the dark chapter of the Miller legacy. A month later, Silas and Celeste traveled together to the territorial capital of Cheyenne. Walking into the grand, wood-paneled office of Territorial Governor William Hale, Celeste presented the original ledger and the deed to the silver claim. Because of the irrefutable proof of Josiah's intent and the Pinkerton documentation, the claim was rightfully authenticated in Celeste's name. Overnight, the discarded mail-order bride became one of the wealthiest landowners in the Wyoming Territory. "You could go back to Boston now," Silas said quietly as they stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the governor's office. He was wearing a new suit, looking uncomfortable but incredibly handsome. "You could buy back your father's house. You could have society, luxury, everything." Celeste turned to him, her violet eyes flashing with a familiar, stubborn fire. She reached out, grasping the lapels of his suit and pulling him slightly downward. "Boston is just brick and noise," she said softly. "My home is a pine cabin on a limestone ridge, and my heart belongs to the man who gave me his coat when the world left me to freeze." Silas smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression that wiped away the last shadows of his past. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close, right there on the busy Cheyenne street. "Then we'd better get back to the mountain, Miss Whitmore. We have a lot of timber to cut if we're going to build a house big enough for a family." They were married the following day by a circuit judge. They didn't return to the Bar M, choosing instead to sell the Cursed Valley land to a consortium of cattlemen. Instead, using the wealth from the silver claim, They built a sprawling, beautiful lodge on the very ridge where Silas had first watched her through his spyglass. It was a home filled with warmth, laughter, and eventually the sound of children running through the pines. The mountain man and the city bride tamed the wild frontier, not with bullets or greed, but with a fierce, unwavering love that proved stronger than the harshest Wyoming winter. Did Celeste and Silas's harrowing frontier romance completely capture your heart? The Wild West was a brutal but beautiful place where true love often bloomed in the most unexpected and highly dangerous circumstances. If you thoroughly enjoyed this thrilling tale of survival, courage, and mountain justice, please smash that like button, share this video with your fellow history and romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more frontier stories.
Hi, my name is Ivy Dark Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Dark Devotion. After watching the video, Mountain Man saw his neighbor abandon a mail order bride at the gate. He welcomed her and found true love. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the contrast between rejection and kindness. This story explores how a single act of compassion can open the door to a completely different future. The emotional heart of the story isn't just about romance. It's about dignity, second chances, and the impact of treating someone with respect when they need it most. One gentle lesson I took from it is that small choices can have meaningful consequences. Sometimes simply offering understanding instead of judgment can make a bigger difference than we realize. Which moment in the story stayed with you the longest? And do you think the relationship would have unfolded the same way without that first act of kindness? Maybe there's a reminder here to be a little more open-hearted in our everyday lives, especially when someone is going through a difficult moment. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like or subscribe. Thanks for spending part of your day with us.